friends, welcome back to Fantasy Awash. Today I am going to be talking about book series and books in general that I just cannot stop gushing about. Let's jump in. Now, there's not really any caveat for this. It's just books that have stuck with me in a really profound way, be it from childhood, adolescence, this year, last week. Really, just any book that I feel deserves high praise, extra love. Some of them are wildly popular, some of them might be a little bit less well known, but I feel like these books have impacted me in ways that were just magical for a lot of them. Some of them are a core part of my identity, I feel like. So let's just talk about all of these books that I really want to start gushing about. The first book that I want to talk about is Good Omens. It's no secret that on my channel, I am a fan of Neil Gaiman. One of my very first videos, I will link that here, is where to start with Neil Gaiman. I just absolutely love him. I got to hear him speak once. It was one of the highlights of my life. I love Neil Gaiman, if it's not abundantly clear. When I read Good Omens, it was one of the funniest books, if not the funniest book that I had ever read up until that point. It still might be the funniest book that I've ever read. And it just left me wanting so much more, but also it felt like the perfect book. And it was my first introduction to Terry Pratchett. The whole thing is just such a magical experience. If you're not familiar with Good Omens, it is a story that is the last 7 days before what is supposed to be the apocalypse on Earth. Our two main characters are an angel and a demon, Crowley and Aziraphale, who team up because they decided that they've really come to like Earth and they don't want it to be destroyed in the next 7 days. And all the comedic events that happen in this story, the way that they interweave religion, the Spanish Inquisition, and just general life in Britain in the early 1990s and late 80s into this story was so masterfully done. I love this book. I think it is such a great read, and I think that everyone should read it. Now I'm going back a little bit in my childhood for this one, but it's not really a surprise, and it's Harry Potter. I love Harry Potter. Harry Potter for me is like a core part of my identity. I still define myself to this day as a Ravenclaw. It is just like a part of my personality and my person. I love the series. I think that it is such a great way to introduce kids to a magical universe. I loved it growing up so much. I still love it as an adult. I love it so much that on my job, which is a recipe developer, I actually wrote all of the recipes that I could for Harry Potter. If you're interested, I can link it down below. But I love Harry Potter. My favorite of the books is probably The Prisoner of Azkaban. It's the one that I have read the most times. In the 7th grade, I just kept rereading it over and over, and I didn't want to put it down because I just loved that book so very much. And at that point, too, not all of the books were out yet, so my choices were slightly limited. The first book, The Philosopher's Stone, actually isn't my favorite of the series. I'd argue it's probably my least favorite, but the series as a whole is one that I go back to regularly. I love it. I love the characters, the story. I know that there's plot holes in it, and I definitely don't love J.K. Rowling, but I do still love the series and what it offered me as a reader, as a child, and as an adult. Now we're going to jump to a few that I've read this year, and some of them might be recency bias, but I just don't care because they're so good. And the first one that we're going to talk about is Piranesi. Piranesi by Susanna Clarke is this amazingly short novel. It's like 220 pages and yet feels like it is longer, but you still want so much more because she manages to accomplish so much in 220 pages. This book has stuck with me in the weirdest possible way because I'm not going to give any spoilers about this book because I really do think it's one that you should go into blind, but the mystery for this book had me so invested. I read it over 2 sittings, and I then dreamt about this book for probably off and on the next 2 months because it has just kept with me in this way that I can't really explain. It's such a moving book. It is such an endearing book, and all the while makes you think about yourself, our reason, our purpose, your spirituality, your intelligence, your surroundings. The whole thing is such a magical read. I cannot say enough good things about Piranesi. It will likely be in my top 5 books of the year because it is that good. The next book that we're going to talk about again is not a surprise if you've been following my channel, and that is The Blade Itself by Joe Abercrombie. I have read the First Law trilogy this year. I'm now reading Best Served Cold as well. I'm trying to make my way through the standalones and then on to the Age of Madness trilogy. I fell in love with The Blade itself probably within the first few lines. I thought it was great, and then when we got to the first Galacta chapter, I was absolutely hooked. I think The Blade itself is my favorite of the original trilogy, which I know isn't the most common opinion. I've been told this read by Kyle specifically, that I am the only person he knows that feels this way. However, my husband also agrees. We both like Blade itself the best of the three, but I think the humor in the whole trilogy is excellent. I love the story. I love the characters. The whole thing just really works for me. I keep pushing it on all of my friends that really like Grimdark. And now we're going to talk about my other favorite Grimdark series that I can't stop gushing about. A Song of Ice and Fire. This is no surprise. I haven't read A Song of Ice and Fire in about 10 years. I'm looking to reread it pretty soon, but where I remember picking up this series for the first time and just being blown away. If I had to pick a book from A Song of Ice and Fire, again, I'm going against the normal conventions and I am going to pick Clash of Kings. I loved book 2 of A Song of Ice and Fire. I love the prologue for this book. It's one of my all-time favorite prologues, and that's saying a lot because the prologue to A Game of Thrones, the book, is so good, but I love the prologue of Clash of Kings. I also love the story arc in general for Daenerys and Jon in this book. I think this is where he really displays how masterful of a writer he is. Character development is so well done in Clash of Kings, and it sets things up really beautifully for most people's favorite, which is Storm of Swords, which is book 3, which is also a phenomenal book. However, for me, I still think it'll be interesting when I reread it to see, when I reference back to this, if I still do prefer Clash of Kings, but I love Clash of Kings so much. I love the whole series so much, but all in all, Clash of Kings definitely, for me, was where it was at when I read it the first time. So if this looks a little bit different, or the positioning looks a little bit different, it's because my microphone died in the middle of this video. So we're now gonna jump back into talking about books that I can't stop gushing about, and the next one would be Circe by Madeline Miller. If you've been following along, you know that not long ago I did a video about all of the mythologies from Circe. I'll link that here. The way that Madeline Miller wrote this book was so beautiful. The way her prose came across was exquisite. Her masterful ability to use the English language but make it sound like a Homeric poem was just breathtaking. Honestly, I loved everything about this book. This might be my new favorite book of all time. I'm telling everyone I know to read it, especially if they like mythology, because if you like mythology, Greek mythology especially, you need to read this book. The way that Miller is able to take Circe, who is a minor character of the Odyssey, make her the protagonist, heroine, and villain simultaneously is just chef's kiss. I can't ask for more in a book. This book for me, top tier, perfection. Everyone should read this book. If it's not clear, please read this book, because I want her to write more books that are like this, and if she thinks we all love it, maybe she will. We're now going to jump back again a little bit and talk a little bit more about mythology books, but it's not going to be the book that of his is called the Norse mythology book. Yes, we were talking about Neil Gaiman, but the two books that, it's got to be 2 books that we are going to talk about are American Gods and Anansi Boys. My first read by Neil Gaiman was actually Stardust. I loved it so much that I wanted to get any of his books into my hands as quickly as I could. American Gods then became that next book. At that point in my life, I was still studying. I was up to my eyeballs in different mythologies, but loved his take on mythology. I love that in American Gods, we have the concept of old gods versus new gods, the fact that you can think gods into existence. They are rooted in America in the ways in which we worship them, pray to them. This to me was so fun. I loved trying to decipher who was who. I also loved all of the clues that he left from the very beginning, basically up until the very end. I was involved with this book from the first sentence to the very last. I loved it. I still love it. I reread it a few years ago prior to that terrible adaptation being aired and reaffirmed my love for this story. I'll probably reread it again in a year or so. But that then leads me to my next mention of his, and that's Anansi Boys. And I feel like this one doesn't get as much love as a lot of his other books, but there's one similar character from American Gods in this book, but it goes in depth into a completely different mythology, new characters. I love that you get to learn more about African folklore, mythology, because this is stuff that I just didn't know until Neil Gaiman opened my eyes to it, and I appreciate it, and I loved it so very much. So if you have not read Anansi Boys by Neil Gaiman or American Gods, please go do so, and you can read them back to back if you'd like to. There are also short stories that Neil Gaiman has written that are basically appendices to American Gods and are also really fun, but these stories are just so good. I love them. Love Neil Gaiman, if it's not clear. We're now going to talk about a more recent read once again, and that will be Tress of the Emerald Sea. Tress for me was an honor and privilege to read. I've said this about a couple of different books, and I'm going to be saying it about my next book as well, but this book is just such a beautiful read. The way that Sanderson is able to take you on this epic journey with this young heroine who grows, matures, changes, discovers herself, discovers life, discovers her purpose, discovers love. The whole thing was so good. There were a couple of moments in the book that I probably would have changed if it was me writing it, but this book had one of my all-time favorite lines or paragraphs really. I quoted it in my review of Tress of the Emerald Sea. I just was so moved about the way that he discusses memories, who we view ourselves in the past, who we are presently, and who we are becoming. I think that this book is a book that anyone should read, fantasy and non-fantasy readers alike, because it's just such a fun story, and you're not missing out. It's not that long of a book, and it's great. You really should read Tress. Now, we're going to talk about one that is incredibly recent because I finished this a couple of days ago, and that is The Lions of Al-Rassan by Guy Gavriel Kay. I had not heard of Guy Gavriel Kay until this past year. I was looking for Christmas gifts to buy my husband, who is very picky with what fantasy books that he likes, and I was suggested by one of the fantasy book groups that I'm in on Facebook that I should get him Guy Gavriel Kay. I'd never heard of him. I randomly decided of all of his books, Lions of Al-Rassan was going to be the book that I gave him. Ended up becoming one of my husband's all-time favorite fantasy books ever. I just read it. I finished it 2 days ago, and I can agree. It is a masterfully done book. Guy Gavriel Kay should offer master classes in character writing, story development, and historical fiction / historical fantasy. This book is just exemplary across the board. If you are looking for a superlative in historical fantasy, this is the book for you. I loved this book. The whole story from start to finish is so intriguing. It's so different from anything that I've ever read. You are so immersed in the story. It once again kind of has that Homeric epic feel, and that there's different books within the book, but the story itself is just heart-wrenching and beautiful and based on historical events. So if you like history and you like fantasy, you really can't go wrong with this book. I highly recommend that you read it. Now, the last book that I want to talk about is another book of historical fiction, but this one isn't fantasy. It is really just historical fiction, and that is Augustus by John Williams. And no, not John Williams, the composer, John Williams, the author. This book came out in the 70s, but it feels still like the way he writes is so relevant and new and fresh that it could have been published last week and you would not be able to tell the difference. John Williams wrote this entire book in epistolary format, meaning that it's written in the form of letters, and gave voices to people that have been dead for 2,000 years and made them all unique, relevant, important, and just special. Ancient history, specifically Roman history, is my expertise of study. This is what I have my master's degree in. I love it. I am very particular about what ancient historical books I read in terms of historical fiction, historical fantasy, because I can get angered a little easily when I feel that they are being a little frivolous with history and characters and character traits. John Williams honored these people in such a beautiful way that it felt real, it felt tangible, it felt accessible. Every voice in this story, from the just random warrior in the military all the way up to Augustus himself and Cicero, Julius Caesar, Augustus's daughter Julia, all of these people were brought to life, and it was done in the most artful, masterful, and articulate way. I cannot say enough good things about this book. If you like historical fiction, this is for you. If you like epistolary format, this is for you. If you want to try historical fiction, please read this book because it is so good. I just absolutely adore this book. Let me know in the comments down below what some of your books are that you can't stop gushing about. I'm always looking for new things to fall in love with. If you would like to help support my channel and like videos like this, you can always hit like and subscribe and leave me a comment down below. If you'd like to follow me on Instagram, you can find me at Fantasy Awash. As always, I'll see you next time. Bye.